Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 presidential election, and I'll be analyzing the state of Wisconsin in specific because we haven't talked about Wisconsin in depth, I think, enough, and this is a very important state, as I'm sure we all know. So today's video will be dedicated solely to talking about Wisconsin and analyzing the paths for both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris in this state. So first, though, let's just briefly pull up the electoral map here. I've filled out the states that I am fairly confident are going to vote a certain way. Obviously, California is safer for Kamala Harris than, say, New Hampshire or Virginia. But I think the point that should be coming across here is that Harris is likely to win at least 226 electoral votes, and Trump is likely to win at least 219, barring upsets. So with that being said, I think, at least from the perspective of Harris, her easiest path is, starting through Michigan and Pennsylvania, to just win 10 more electoral votes. In Wisconsin, the good thing for Harris is that Wisconsin does that because Wisconsin would get her to exactly 270, assuming she won the other two Rust Belt states. I think Wisconsin and Arizona are actually similar in the sense that they're both pure toss-ups at this point, and Democrats could rely on doing well in either of them. And obviously, if Harris were to lose Wisconsin but win Arizona, she'd still win the election. Now, Donald Trump, on the other hand, I think Wisconsin comes in at a kind of a different route. I expect him to win North Carolina. It could go for Harris, but I think right now that's probably the easiest state for him to win of these. And I think if Trump were competitive or if Trump had a good chance of winning the election, he'd also be winning Georgia. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Harris can still win the election if she just wins these three Rust Belt states. So even if Trump wins Nevada and Arizona, it doesn't matter what happens. That doesn't matter if Harris wins the three Rust Belt states. So that's a problem for Trump. But let's say he wins Wisconsin. At that point, he would just need to win Nevada aside. He just need to win one more of these states. He could actually afford to lose Nevada, but as long as he carried one more of these states, he'd still win the presidency. So at this point, Nevada kind of isn't relevant, unfortunately, for people who live in Nevada. Because again, let's say he won Wisconsin and Arizona, he'd be the president. So that's where Wisconsin comes in. It's not going to be the state that I think is, going to put someone on the map on the path to 270. I think for Trump, he's going to have to start out North Carolina and Georgia. For Harris, I think she's going to start out in Michigan and Pennsylvania. But if we give these states their respective candidates, Wisconsin becomes very important because literally, if Harris wins Wisconsin, the election is over. Whereas if Trump wins Wisconsin and then Arizona, the election's over, but to his benefit. So Wisconsin is very important in that way, and I think that obviously it's clear because both candidates are making a huge play for it. So just to kind of go back and talk with this state, the best, and again, for those of you who aren't familiar with my methodology, I actually don't talk about this a lot. I make statistical models. I look at a lot of data, but my predictions aren't tied to my models. I use them because I trust them, because I like them as a reference point, but I've broken from my models before. My models have been right when I've been wrong, and I've been right when my models have been wrong. So just to talk about how I go about actually doing the prediction on the night before the election, what I like to do is I like to sit down for, each state probably gets a good 15, 20 minutes of like internal debate. And I will literally write a T-chart, one side for Trump, one side for Harris, and I will write the advantages that each candidate has in the state, weigh them, and see which side looks better. And so we're going to do that a bit in today's video, and I'll be doing this over the course of the next few weeks, and you're going to see it in my final election night prediction because I'll be doing that after after I talk about, or once I've done my analysis in depth for the big 7 states, right? For Wisconsin and for the other states in my final prediction, you're going to see that. But today, I'll give you a preview of what I think for Wisconsin as of right now. And this is subject to change because obviously Wisconsin is a swing state, and if polls show a big shift in the next few weeks, I will probably change my prediction according to that. But with that being said, Wisconsin. This is a state where Democrats have won the majority of the time since 2016, but they haven't actually swept it. And that makes it different from, say, Michigan or Pennsylvania, where Democrats have not won a federal statewide race, or Democrats, have not lost a federal statewide race since they lost to Trump in 2016. Wisconsin, in 2022, we actually saw Republicans win a Senate race here, albeit by a closer margin than expected. And we've also seen Republicans have more success in House races in Wisconsin than they have in Michigan or Pennsylvania. So that's something to note here. And what I think is interesting about this state is that there are a lot of like really weird trends that I think don't exist even in the other Midwestern swing states. One of such trends is that unlike what you would see outside of Detroit or Philadelphia, the suburbs of Milwaukee are still pretty red. These are what we call the WOW counties, and they have been a pretty significant part of the GOP coalition for the past 20, 30 years in Wisconsin. And again, when you look at why Trump won the state in 2016, it's because he did very well in these counties, or he did well enough to win. Actually, in 2016, Trump didn't do particularly well compared to Mitt Romney 4 years prior, but again, he did well enough to win. But in 2020, if you look at the shifts, we saw a 6-point swing away from Trump in Waukesha, a 2-point swing away from him in Washington, and a 7% swing away from him in Ozaukee. And again, he lost the state by 20,000 votes. So those swings, again, when you combine the votes that, when you account for the margins as a proportion of statewide turnout in these three counties, that matters a lot for Joe Biden, and it really was pivotal here because, again, this was a 20,000 vote margin. These are big counties, right? Like Waukesha in specific cast well over 260,000 votes in 2020. So these things do matter. Now, the thing about the WOW counties is that in 2022, Republicans really should have done well here, and especially Waukesha as our comparison here. In the governorship, Republicans only won by 21 points, less than that actually, and that was a margin very similar to the presidential race. And so the problem that Republicans have had here is that they haven't been able to actually win back voters in the WOW counties. And again, these are suburban counties, but they're conservative. These aren't like I would say socially liberal suburbs that you might see outside of Chicago or Minneapolis or even Detroit, right? These are pretty Republican suburbs, and Trump's going to win these counties again, right? The question isn't whether he wins them. The question is how much he wins them by. And again, in 2022, Republicans did worse than expected here, and I think in part because of the abortion issue, right? Not all people who are going to be pro-choice are necessarily socially liberal, and a lot of voters in Wisconsin in 2022 voted for the Democratic incumbent governor because Democrats made abortion messaging a huge part of their campaign. So that's what we have to note here. And Harris, I think, has done that to an extent with her campaign. She's talked about abortion a lot, obviously, because it is an issue that Democrats have a bit of an advantage in terms of how the electorate perceives it. So in these counties, I do expect Trump to struggle because he struggled here in 2020, and since then, Democrats really hammered him. And a big part of the 2024 Harris campaign that was not present in the 2020 Biden campaign was this element of extremism, right? Biden's campaign was about how Trump wasn't nice. We wanted to return the soul of the nation. Trump is, like the whole Biden thing was like, now we're going to restore decency to the White House, all that, right? The Harris campaign isn't about that. The Harris campaign is, look, Trump is extreme. Here's why that's bad. Here's why you should vote for me. And who else would that messaging be tailored to and crafted for, if not conservative-leaning suburban voters who were open to voting Democrat in the past couple of election cycles? And then we saw it to an extent in 2020. I think in these areas we're going to see it in 2024. A big part of this, by the way, is the demographics here. These are mostly white counties. If you believe the polls, Harris relative to Biden is doing better with white voters, but worse with voters of color. If that is directionally true, even if the magnitude's not the same, even if we do see that slippage to an extent for Harris with voters of color, but maybe she gains a little bit with white voters, right? Grain of salt, obviously, because the polls are often wrong, but let's say I believe that. That would not have as big of an impact in the WOW counties, which are majority white, as it would in, say, Milwaukee. And that's going to bring me to my next segment here in a second. But the WOW counties for now, I do believe Harris will do better. These are Democratic trending areas. I think her campaign has been run well enough to win over these voters, or some of them at least. And on top of that, if you believe the polling data, we're likely to see Harris do better in these areas relative to Biden than she would in maybe areas that are majority black or majority Hispanic, for example. So let's talk about Milwaukee now, which is an area where Democrats are going to need good turnout in. But again, this is a city where Democrats rely on black turnout to do well. And if black turnout is a problem for them, that's going to hurt Democrats statewide. So the good thing about early vote data is that we don't necessarily always have the best indicator of who's voted by party, and we obviously don't know who the votes are going for, but we do know the demographics. So, for example, we know the county comparison. So if we see Milwaukee County is casting a higher share of votes than expected, that's a good thing for Kamala Harris. This is a blue county. If it's casting a lower share of votes than expected, that's bad news, because obviously Harris is going to win Milwaukee County by a good amount. The question is the turnout. And so in Milwaukee County, turnout, that's what matters here. I guarantee, I would be shocked if Kamala Harris doesn't go to Milwaukee between now and Election Day. I'd be shocked. I think it would be malpractice if she didn't. And Donald Trump is obviously going to visit the more conservative parts of Wisconsin. He might visit Milwaukee too. But here's the point, right? Harris needs turnout. And in 2022, we saw was the Democrats actually did okay in Milwaukee. Tony Evers netted, let's see, he netted around 150,000 votes out of this out of the county. Mandela Barnes netted 143,000, so there was a bit of a ticket split, but it was 140, 150K for Democrats. Milwaukee in 2020, obviously Biden netted more. He netted, let's see, around 180,000 votes, which I think is pretty good. But again, 2022 Democrats held up well here, right? Like turnout in midterms is usually like 50 to 60% of what it was in presidential elections. But Milwaukee, the amount Democrats netted, if you take the Senate race, or the governor's race, or the average, I can't talk today, the average of those two races, it was like, 147K. And Biden here, based on my potentially inaccurate mental math, netted, let's see, I just want to make sure I'm doing this right to it. Yeah, 187,000 votes. That's, roughly, I want to say 14.5 out of 18.5 if we're rounding, right? And I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but that's like that's in the mid 70s. So that means that Milwaukee turnout dropped off by less than Wisconsin turnout as a whole, based off my very rough mental math. I don't know the exact numbers because I'm not going to pull out a calculator and stop the video right now, but I do know it's in the mid 70s, which is less than the state of Wisconsin dropped off by. So what do we know about that? We know that because of that, Democrats were able to win the governorship and be competitive in the Senate race. So that's why this matters for Kamala Harris. Now, for Trump, it's easy. Trump can just say, hey, look, if turnout for Milwaukee as a proportion of the state drops by a couple points, we're in good shape. We're favored to win the state. And so that's what he's going to hope for. But again, you can't really bank on that because you can't control it. Donald Trump can't go to Milwaukee and just stop people from voting, right? So that's what it comes down to, is turnout in Milwaukee. And that's why I think it's a bit less interesting to analyze, because there's less persuasion. It's just turnout. But we'll be watching that closely. Now, Dane County, I think, is probably the best part of the state for Democrats, because turnout there has been huge. Just to compare this, in 2020, Biden netted 182K votes here. If we look at the Senate race, Mandela Barnes netted 160K votes. So, literally just 20,000 votes less. And actually in the governor's race, it's probably even better. Democrats netted this is going to be, that's going to be like, that's going to be a bit more than if you can tell, I'm avoiding saying numbers because I got a number, but I'm not sure if it's right. But again, Milwaukee or Madison in Dane County was roughly like 85% of 2020 turnout, which is huge. And that's what matters, right? These counties dropped off in terms of turnout less, and I think that's a good sign for 2024 for Democrats, because if the counties turn out in the midterms, they're going to turn out in the presidential election, right? So Madison, Dane County going to turn out, Milwaukee County going to turn out as well, I think. But obviously Dane County is a bigger, I think, a bit better for Democrats than Milwaukee. But we'll be watching that very closely. So that's the good news for Harris, right? She's going to, I think, get the necessary turnout in Dane and Milwaukee to put her at a good chance here. The good news for Trump, though, is that Harris is going to lose ground in the rural areas, and no one's talking about it. If we look at the 2020 result, we saw pretty much a mixed bag in rural Wisconsin. Some counties trended left, some trended right, but overall it was kind of a wash. Biden did relatively well in these counties, right? Like, if you compare rural Wisconsin, if I just go down to, like, Missouri, and you look at these counties, they're deep red. If I go to, say, Reynolds County, Missouri, Biden got 16% there. He got 21% in Benton. He got 13% in Wright. Whereas you go to rural Wisconsin, it's a bit bluer up there. It's still pretty Republican leaning, but hold on. But if we go to Wisconsin, right, Biden was at 38, 42, 33, 32, 36. He was in the mid 30s, high 30s, low 40s. And so what we do know is that even though I think some polls are suggesting Harris is going to hold a poll with white voters, that mostly comes from white suburban voters, not rural white voters. If there is a demographic Trump improves with this election, I think it's going to be white rural voters. The Harris campaign has made this campaign a lot about issues like democracy, extremism, abortion. I think that's tailored for the suburbs, like I mentioned earlier when I talked about the WOW counties. I don't think it's tailored great for the rural areas. Now, the good news for Harris, I think, is that Tim Walz, there's a chance he connects with these voters. There's a chance that maybe they see something in him, but I don't think it's going to be enough, and VPs often don't matter in that way. So if I were betting, I would say these counties are going to swing right. Obviously, for Trump, that's definitely a good thing. The concern for him is that it's not going to be a big enough swing to, neutralize what's going to be happening to him in Madison and in Milwaukee and potentially in the WOW counties, because, again, there's more population down here than there is up here. But it's something to note. And, again, Wisconsin is a state demographically, just to talk about the big picture here as we wrap up, it's a state where Republicans are doing better. It's mostly white. It's pretty rural broadly. For most swing states, it's quite rural. It's also a state where Republicans did win a Senate race in 2022 with a incumbent who wasn't that popular. Again, Democrats did kind of give up a Mandela bar, which they really shouldn't have. They could have won. This was a winnable race for them. They didn't play at their best. But again, Republicans did win a federal race here. And by the way, another thing I haven't talked about, but it's important to note, Republicans did quite well in Green Bay in 2022. That could be, potentially an avenue for offsetting some losses down here on the coast. So it's an interesting state. Now, I would rather be Kamala Harris in Wisconsin right now, just because the factors here are bigger than the factors up here and potentially up here. But it's going to be interesting. And I'm going to do more math on Wisconsin as we get closer to Election Day, and I'm going to keep you all posted. So with that, please subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you all think. Tell me who you think is going to win Wisconsin. I always like to see comments from people who actually live in these states. I'm not from Wisconsin, unfortunately, so I don't have maybe the same on-the-ground input that a lot of other people have. I've heard stories that are good for Trump. I've heard stories that are good for Harris. So let me know what you think. And again, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.